you're an interdisciplinary group. I don't know your background. So I'm going to leave lots of time for questions, and my idea is I'll introduce some things, and some things may sound like way out there. And so if you can ask, we can come back to that, and we can talk a bit more. So this, why do that? This talk is very much about a set of unexpected relationships. Most of my work is on the relational, it's on relations and relations between places. So like the right side of the tracks and the wrong side of the tracks. So today I'm going to talk about an actual place, I'm going to talk about a history and an erased place, and I'm going to talk more generally about settler-colonial society as a system in relation to the erasure of Indigenous land occupation and culture. So if it feels like I'm all over the place, it's because I need all of these kind of pieces to tell the story. But if you keep in mind those relations, so this isn't the right side of the tracks and the wrong side of the tracks, it's a relation in time that I want to focus on. Thank you to the City Institute and to Roger. This is a project which came out of comes out of the Global Suburbanisms project, and I was simply assigned or asked to write a profile of the suburb in Edmonton. And of course, not really properly reading the email, I thought I could write a profile of whatever suburb I wanted, and so I emailed back and said, okay, I'd love to do like, what's a fancy, interesting, historically important suburb that everybody would love to write about. No, just stick with Edmonton. I said, well, what about Calgary? Or how about Vancouver? Or there must be somewhere more interesting than Edmonton. No, it was going to be Edmonton. And I fear that the book has not come out. It's called North American Suburbs. And I fear that I'm probably the cause of the whole sort of project grinding to a halt. Because as we started to look at Edmonton with a group of students, we had this initial idea that we would look at health and suburbia, and this project just emerged out of nowhere, almost. And that's the strange thing. So I realized that I didn't really know very much about where I was. Can we turn out the So this is the place, the actual place. This is Millwoods in the southeast side of Edmonton. I'm going to assume you know nothing about Edmonton. I'm going to introduce. No, you could just turn them off, actually. Yeah. And it's resolutely low density, flat, sprawl, and there it makes no pretense to be anything more than what it is. That's a shot out over a shopping mall, and there's a variety of different residential typologies and there. So where are we? Well, this is Edmonton, a block of land with a larger city region, basically grouped around the North Saskatchewan River. It's about there. It's about exactly where Alberta would balance if you balance it on a pin. If you cut it out and balance it on a pin. This is the satellite version of it, and it gives you a good idea. Again, you can sort of see there's this block. You can see the sprawl out. This is about a 50-kilometer distance across. And what's revealing in this is not only you see the river, but you see these blocks. So these white areas are industrial rooftops. And so you can see where the residential and industrial areas are. And I'm going to be talking about this square here that is a suburb developed in the 1970s as a self-contained new satellite, not a separate city, but a kind of satellite suburb. There are, at the same time, much more suburban areas that are quite built up out out in here. So that are actually satellite towns that together make up about 26 different municipalities in the Alberta capital region. It's a capital city, university, and of course, very much, the economy is very much driven by the oil services sector. Fort McMurray is about 4 hours drive north, and a lot of the staging for Fort McMurray comes through Edmonton or is based in Edmonton, that's in fact what this is. Just as an aside, while we have this up, there's a discussion about how you define what a suburb is, and that of course is kind of the sort of thing academics love to debate, and just how one defines a suburb is, one way of doing it is around automobile transit. So commuter, how do you get to work? With the idea that people would be traveling to work, but the people who live in Millwoods largely work in these industrial areas here. They don't go to the city center at all. So it's not quite clear whether it's a suburb or it's actually the center economically. Here's the river valley that was squiggling through, and I wanted to show this just to kind of give the contrast with the low rise, to show the downtown and the historic railroad hotel, the Hotel MacDonald. So in this river valley with its sort of unstable banks and fairly underdeveloped, mostly used by mountain bikers, and difficult to access because of its underdeveloped nature. The university would sit right up here approximately. It's the world's largest urban park, but it's mostly empty. So when you're on a canoe, you've got it to yourself, and you kind of see the city from underneath. This is important because this really is at the core of Edmonton's raison d'etre. It was a river crossing, and that river essentially cuts the province in half. So to go north, you have to somewhere get across the North Saskatchewan. It's quite shallow, and this kind of very, very fine, silty, muddy kind of clay that you just sort of slide into the river, and how do you climb out of that? So for centuries, this has been the meeting ground of Indigenous people. It's the traditional land of the Cree, Beaver, and Métis peoples, and governed by Treaty 6, it's called, a Western Treaty. I know here is one of the Upper Canada treaties governs, or does not govern. One of the Upper Canada treaties signed with the Haudenosaunee and what are the other local Anishinaabe and Algonquin? No. Mississauga, Credit River, Mississauga, and Métis. So this was a crucial crossroads and a meeting place essentially between where the land is turning into prairie and where it's a more wooded boreal forest. Boreal forest in the sense of kind of swampy, boggy, spruce trees, and you're hunting moose, right? Moose, beaver. South is more open grasslands and scrub. You're hunting deer and buffalo in a traditional. So here is the original concept for Millwoods. It's a dot on a map. In late August, the fields really are yellow. It's mustard and canola, rapeseed, and that must very much have looked like planting a social idea, as a square on this kind of prairie landscape to the planners. That the idea was to create affordable housing. What had happened was that there was a demographic boom through the 1960s, which contributed to rising house prices, and there'd been a commission. I'm not going to go into a lot of details, but I'm happy to talk in more detail if you want. There was the Hellier Commission recommended social and a governmental policy for housing, and also endorsed the idea of land banking. So a National Housing Act. Those ideas sort of started up in the 60s, and the National Housing Act really facilitated the assembly of these lands through expropriation in the early 70s. And so land was given away by lottery at below market prices. So people lined up to get land, and they built often through various forms of shared construction labor. They built a 60s suburb there. It's interesting because I think it's the first land bank like this in North America. So it has some historical importance in terms of planning tools and planning process. In the Global Suburbanisms Project, you had Marcus Moose here recently. This is a map that he did. Here you have this question of how people get to work, and I raised the problem of where they're going. So here's Edmonton, and again you see Millwoods sitting as a residential area, these industrial areas with almost no residents at all. The river, and the downtown core, which is more walkable and bicyclable. It's really difficult to actually figure out what happens. A lot of people they drive in Edmonton to light rail transit stations, but on the census data that shows up as driving to work. It doesn't show up, the mix of modes doesn't show up. Here it is again. So there's a ring road idea, and essentially Edmonton had built out to here by about 1965, and so this was adding the logical next block. It also represents the departure in the sort of traditional development of Edmonton, which was going on kind of this axis along the river to move south. And one of the things that was put in with that was an international airport 20 kilometers south. So even 10 years ago, it was quite a rural sort of experience driving out to it. And then there's this. This is a map as we started to look at the area of Millwoods, just kind of right in the middle of this almost. One of the historical maps that emerges is this survey for the Papaschase reservation. It's probably dated around 1860, and Edmonton didn't have so much a resident Aboriginal Indigenous population as it was this kind of meeting place and crossroads. With the development of Hudson's Bay Trading Post, which was kind of up here, very close to where that picture from the river, from the canoe was shot. With the development of a Hudson's Bay Trading Post, a number of Indigenous people moved or frequented the area more often. So the effect was that there was more of an Indigenous population. A reserve was created, and the result was a campaign to relocate Indigenous people from the river valley out to these kind of flat areas to the south of the settlement as it was then. That's the relationship between the two, this is Millwoods, and this is the Papaschase Reservation. And there's a striking, it's striking that in that landscape, which is resolutely North American suburbia, resolutely sprawl, there's a few names on developments. There's a few indications here and there, but it's almost completely an erased presence. It's, first of all, an Indigenous reservation has no sense being on that specific land. It's the land that isn't valuable, but also it's really thoroughly erased. And yet, at the same time, it's a presence. According to a recent court case, the Papaschase tribe, those who would be entitled to residence on the reserve, no longer exists. And that brings us to the question of Aboriginals, as defined under the Canadian Government Acts, and Indigenous peoples. So there was a campaign locally to have Indigenous people take scrip. And to take scrip means that they would surrender their claims to land in return for about $75 and food rations. In the context of food insecurity and essentially the experience of starvation, many people took scrip at the time. And so that was essentially the end of the Papaschase band, if it had ever existed. It's more like the Slave Lake Cree who were passing through and resident in the area under Chief Papaschase. So this question, the question of the existence of the Papaschase tribe has recently been debated in court, and basically on the technicality that they've lost their Indigenous status, it's been ruled that there is no longer anyone who has a claim to this land. It was on that basis that in 1888 the reserve was actually annulled, and as the Minister of Native Affairs at the time said, his name was Frank Oliver, and he's a forebear of other Olivers. What was not only was this reserve going to be eliminated, but reserves would no longer or could no longer stand in the way of development and of the economic expansion of settlement. Dwayne Donald has called this sense of Edmonton as standing on a kind of erased ground, a kind of pentimento. There's a kind of underpainting. It's a sort of a palimpsest, you know, when you erase and you can still see the marks from your pencil that is showing through. But where it shows through and how it shows through, that's the question. This is Millwoods as it was being constructed. This is what it looks like today. It's a hyper-diverse community. It represents about 85% of the what we call the world's ethnic groups. It's a key magnet for different communities. But oddly, the Indigenous population is quite low. It's under 5%. And that's odd because Edmonton's Indigenous population is just over 16%, which makes it the Indigenous capital of Canada. So these kind of suburbs, the mix of housing, the importance of cars, streets, parking lots, that kind of infrastructure won't be any surprise to people here. Perhaps what is surprising is just generally there are high rises. This picture is taken from one, but there aren't that many. So The, the Indigenous presence ends up as things like a plaque in the mall. This one, championed by the current elected chief, Calvin Bruno. And Edmonton, I moved from Ottawa to Edmonton, and one of the things about going from Ontario to out west is the what sociologists would call the relationships between elites. So basically, if you're an academic, you have easy access to people, and Calvin is no exception. He's a bus driver, so you can see Calvin on the bus, and there's this intertwining of different elites in the city, which is quite distinct from Ontario, most Ontario cities. So by 1885, most of the local Indigenous people had been forced by starvation and impoverishment to take scrip. There's a wonderful article by Dwayne Donald, which is built around a photograph of his great-grandmother, who's dressed in a funeral outfit, rented, and a photograph taken outside in the middle of winter in front of Frank Oliver's mansion. And the question is, he asks, is why is she in funeral wear in front of the local newspaper publisher who became the minister, first of all the agent for Native Affairs, and then the minister, and was instrumental in constructing the Indian Act. What is this about, this posing in front of his residence? So through the 1900s, like for example in 1911, the Indian Act was amended to allow for the expropriation of Indian lands for public works, and that further undermines the status of Indigenous lands. So places such as the Papaschase reservations appear really as absences or inconsistencies more than as clear presences in contemporary cities. Enter the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. So this is recent. So they published their Volume 1 summary in, I think, 2015. It's the outcome of 20 years of work. So there's Volume 1, and then there's 10 plus volumes beyond that, and then there's another 20 volumes of various commissions leading up to it. So it's, and that is a really under-researched set of documents which are sitting there all online, a real opportunity for student papers and for research. They make the point that consistent with my description here of the fate of the Papaschase Reserve, that for over a century, the central goals of Canadian policy, the government policy, was to eliminate Indigenous government, to ignore rights, to terminate treaties, and basically through assimilation, to cause Aboriginal people to cease to exist. And people are most familiar, perhaps, with the residential schools that the Commission quite strategically labeled cultural genocide. And it's a very deliberate choice of words with an important history, which we could talk about in terms of the United Nations declarations on genocide. So my argument essentially is that there's another set of mechanisms that, for cultural genocide, and they're geographical. And that what we see in the Papaschase Reserve, essentially what we stumble into in our research, is that Edmonton's really interesting. This is a case of a North American suburb, which gives us the opportunity to inject into this kind of survey book, which was sort of like ticking off various suburbs, so many Canadian ones, so many American ones, so many from the West, so many from the East, etc. here we can get the Indigenous history into it. In Canada, Indigenous issues are mostly missing from the suburban literature. It's unlike Australia, and there's a kind of sense of an inversion that Indigenous people are in the city centres in Canada, they're in suburbia in Australia. So there's a kind of set of inversions, but what's common, and where I want to finish is this idea of the settler-colonial society. So here's the intended effect of the residential schools, and essentially the intended effect of the annulment of the Papaschase reservation was the same. So just to kind of remind you a little bit of a mosaic map of Indigenous peoples, and Edmonton had its share of other elements of that residential school policy, including residential schools and hospitals. There was almost, there are 86 at the end of, there's over 100 when the policy ended around 1986 for over 100 residential schools. So this problem then, the problem for the Papaschase is a problem of status. They had lost their status as Indians under the Indian Act, so they couldn't lay claim to the reservation. But they were clearly there. But then there was also a problem of documentation that exists within government documents, but also memory and oral history, which is often about, in the Edmonton case, about the river valley. That's the important site, not an arbitrary acreage to the south of the city. Settler-colonial societies. Just to 5 minutes on this. So it's hard to connect this material it's hard to connect contemporary Millwoods to the Papaschase reservation in the past as a relationship in time. But there are other relationships, for example, from Canada to Australia to South Africa, which are also an important part of the story, because we know, or it's widely understood, that the reservations were a kind of test policy for what was later established in South Africa as Bantustans. The colonial administration under British rule was mobile. People moved from one colony to another. So we can see under there's a marvelous author, Patrick Wolfe, who argues that settler-colonial society is a system and it's ongoing. It's systemic. It's not that cultural genocide isn't an event that happens in one place. It's the result of an ongoing set of institutionalized practices. He traces the effect on bodies. So, for example, essentially, the focus is to displace and remove Indigenous people from land, which then can be developed using imported bodies, either settlers or other indentured laborers. So if you think of the Canadian history with Chinese indentured laborers, or the ongoing pattern of migration policy, you can see that we're still in a kind of a tradition that's set up in a settler-colonial model. The interesting thing about Wolfe's work is it's kind of like reading Marx on the economy for policies concerning people in the Commonwealth. So, for example, the destiny of those Indigenous people is essentially to be assimilated or disappear. So, for those Indigenous people, one drop of pure or non-Indigenous white blood makes them all of a sudden not Indians. They lose their claim to any rights as Indigenous people. But by contrast, for those who are enslaved or indentured, imported laborers, one drop of non-pure colonial blood makes them not part of the white elite. So the logic works in reverse. So having a kind of structural explanation for how racism works at that level, I think is a hugely powerful tool and makes us see racism from a different perspective, which applies specifically to Canada, Australia, and so on. Out of all of this, I think that for geographers and planners and urban designers, there's a real sea change which is going on, which I think it's hard to appreciate as much perhaps in Ontario as it's really having an impact in places like Edmonton on people like planners and what they do from day to day. First of all, I think that and I have some thoughts on what the implications are. So, and this is all perhaps offered as a set of opportunities for research. First of all, is a paradigm shift, because all of a sudden we need to deal with absences. Geography is focused on what you find in a place. This is about what's missing in the place. How we read and see the landscape, how we engage with it. What is the role and the way that bodies relate to the landscape? Whose bodies? Who is producing knowledge? Who is receiving knowledge? How do we articulate place-based knowledge? So sort of traditions of representation, for example. I think it involves a whole bunch of experimentation, which is required. So we're really in a really interesting moment of trying out different approaches. So participatory, but conversation and dialogue, witnessing, witnessing. And what do all of these things mean? What does it mean? There's a tradition for storytelling and planning, as really the discursive aspects of planning process. What does that mean in the context of intercultural groups who have very different stories to tell? How does the visual, what's the role of the visual beyond map making as a performative process? What are the practice-based approaches? For example, walking in the place, right? Tours, walking, site-based interactions. And I think we need much more critically developed epistemologies around memory, oral history, and so on. And I think that currently, as it stands in planning in particular, the curriculum is so driven by what's required by the professions. It's hard to find a space to include this in the curriculum. I think there's a real role for the academy to kind of push this as a research agenda to get our practitioner colleagues to see that this is going to demand a different toolkit for decolonial planning, right? What is this going to actually be able to include things that are largely absent in the landscape or are intangible, which means you can't walk to the historical tree and say, that's the tree. Edmonton's just taking down, I think, one of the first trees planted by a Métis settler. It's on the university property. It's a Garneau's tree. Places like Sri Lanka, they have trees that date back centuries. The people's tree in Sri Lanka. So it's very interesting. We don't treat the symbolic elements within the natural landscape as something that can help tell these different stories of different groups, because we need to hear the Indigenous, and I recognize that so far all we can talk about is mostly the story of settlers in Canada. So thank you very much, and I'm happy to expand on whatever your particular interest is, because I've covered everything like just with a thin layer of margarine, I think. Thanks.
In fact, yes, thank you, Rob. We have some time for questions, and I will have to give you the microphone so we can record what you're saying. Any comments? comments, questions? Professor Lehrer?
Just quickly with what you ended about the tree, why had it to be removed? What are the interests that are conflicting with the history?
It's too old. And not just, what's interesting is that there isn't a conflict over it. That the way it's represented is that it's at the end of its lifespan and an arborist knows best, and it's too close to the parking lot, so it might fall on someone's truck. So there's a whole hierarchy of values implied in that, and the lack of mobilization is like something that sort of is slipping under the radar. I think our experience with establishing a planning curriculum in Edmonton is exactly where do you put this in the curriculum? Where's the fit of this intangible heritage, for example? Yeah, thanks.
You could briefly say who you are and ask a question.
Yeah, thanks.
Hello, I'm Andre. Andre.
It doesn't project, it's just for the recording.
Okay, so okay, I'm Andre Ortega. My question is about the relationship of the indigenous with academia and perhaps planning in Edmonton. How much are the indigenous involved in planning, and are there sort of particular projects that involve this kind of collaboration between academia and planning and indigenous?
So the problem for planning is that it really is one of the colonial technologies of settlement, and especially in Canada and remarkably in the Canadian West, the surveyor's grid rules. And you can see from a plane, you can see the kind of checkerboard that's been created, interrupted only by an occasional river or inconvenient bit of topography. So Indigenous people are largely absent from the planning process and the curriculum. It's difficult to find a place, right? There's no kind of course you can create on Indigenous planning. So there have been initiatives around Indigenous planning in Canada and elsewhere. There are the university stands on Métis land, and it has, for example, a faculty of Native Studies. I think it might be the only faculty of Native Studies in Canada. So there's a whole faculty which includes planners in the faculty, but it's very much a planning program over here and a faculty of Native Studies with a planner in it over here. So there's a huge disjuncture. Yeah, Lucy Tallbear. So most of the work has been done by people in education who've been interested in the pedagogy of the landscape. How can you communicate a past Indigenous presence, especially in the River Valley? Central to that is asking people to engage with it in a different way, to slow down, to listen, to think about what they see, smell, hear around them. The River Valley is an important source of medicinal plants. And the university also, we think, first of all, of the sort of shortcomings. We have an arboretum, a botanical garden, which includes an important moraine, which is a sacred site and very important because it has very specific plants growing there. So it was actually a place people came to get those medicines, and that is. So what do you do with that? Do you put a plaque there? You sort of write, oh, this was important, or how do you get people to engage with that pentimento, those sort of layers? And how does one get people to appreciate a different way of engaging with the landscape as an ecosystem that people are inside of, rather than as a kind of platform that you put your productive, your crops on the top 4 inches, or perhaps you build your building and you stand on it. And any bushes are sort of in your way. You kind of clear away as much as possible. So I think that's part of the challenge. At the same time, the city has really taken on this, the action points for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They set out 90-some action points, and really asking people to incorporate a change of attitude in their everyday lives. And that's been incorporated in the city by restructuring the bureaucracy entirely. So there's no longer, for example, a transportation department. That was done away with in order to facilitate a different approach to infrastructure, which would be more inclusive. But I think it's really an opportunity for learning lessons, experimenting, and asking questions. And I think it's not just the Commonwealth countries, like the Philippines also has Indigenous people. There are patterns all over, and I think it's as interesting for its contrasts. So in a way, let's need another MCRI. We've kind of tripped over this thing sticking up out of the ground. Oh, there it is.
So my name is Elsa, we just met. I actually had a question. It's more a theoretical or conceptual question about the way that you conceptualize absences and how you sort of detect or
Yes.
yeah.
Yes. So this question of presence and absence really goes to the heart of Western and European epistemologies, and really is at the foundation of positivism. It's present, you can touch it. It's positive. It's a presence. It has its own inconsistencies. People like Derrida, or even way before him, Heidegger or Hegel, pointed out, how do you know about an absence? Because it has to be a present absence. So there's a kind of a bit of a non sequitur built into the logic there. So the question is, what are we being asked to do? Are we being asked to somehow or other give some sort of representation, or to articulate or engage with an absence? Or is it a question of the intangible? So like landscape, for example, it isn't any one particular plant. It's a much larger intangible good, like a brand or an ecosystem. I think there's a spectrum which goes right off to the point of really where there's no division. That division between presence and absence isn't being made, and the divisions of temporal succession aren't being made. Events don't happen and then they're in the past and they're absent. They kind of continue on, and in a way, people continue on, much as we would say the Queen continues from one body to the next. It is still the Queen, and so a person might continue, or a spirit. So that line between presence and absence, which really is at the foundation of Western epistemology, and logic, bourgeois logic, A does not equal B. That kind of thinking really is drawn into question. How do you put that into a planning process which is able to accommodate multiple voices? That's really a challenge, and a lot of it means that requires it not being reduced to a representation. You can't reduce it to like one set of words or a thing, but it's part of a process. One suggestion has been that this is not so much a matter of representing the presence of something that is past, but rather embarking on a process of interacting with it, so engaging with it. It's a more, I think you'd call it engagement, and that this would also be a position from which at least advocates in places like Oka would say they're not speaking for the landscape or for the integrity of a river ecosystem, but they're speaking, as part of it. And they would be happy to, use Derrida and Deleuze to defend that kind of speaking of and speaking with rather than speaking as, which is a kind of an anthropological problem we have in European logic. But that's another story. Does that help? It's a really, it raises a set of questions which are theoretical, and I think we should seize this. It's really a call to get in there, and everyone's needed.
Could you say a few more words comparing the old colonialism with the indigenous to the new colonialism with the new immigrants? The new colonialism is in brackets, of course.
Yeah. So the argument for settler-colonial societies would be that we continue in that logic. We just are now in a globalized settler-colonial logic of eliminating some bodies and replacing them with others. So that process of temporary foreign workers would be could be included in that overall sort of process. But more specifically, the question would be: does suburbia continue the logic of the settler-colonial moment in Canadian history? And our sense from this case is that it does. That it is about occupying a place which is land, which is there just for me. I don't have to worry about its history or anything else. I have my piece of property, and that's that's entirely for me. So that continues this sort of logic of being allocated a quarter section in the prairies and being sent out to find the corner stakes, and to then sort of improve the land by essentially taking the trees off, taking the wildlife off in order to replace it with productive crops. Settler-colonial theory argues that this isn't just a colony, it's a colony with settlers, and it's a very specific system, that the way in which the settler elite functions and is a part of the displacement of indigenous populations, who one way or another are made to disappear. And that's, I think, whether in South Africa, Australia, Canada, and they would argue that we can see this currently in operation, or we can see this model in operation in places like Palestine, in the West Bank. We see a similar logic happening. So it's a real critical, it's got a really critical edge, that settler-colonial theory. It's not something I've heard discussed in planning or geography. We tend to talk about the native problem in Canadian cities. It's as if that level of the system or the structure, that level of reflection was not available to us. Last week, we had an announcement of compensation for the 60s scoop generation who were adopted out, in many cases, without their families' kind of understanding or knowledge. And the minister, whose name I've forgotten, but gave this tearful kind of presentation and saying, how could this have happened? And who would imagine that these children would be better off taken away from their communities? All correct, but all sounding as if this was a one-off in global history. And without that sense that there is a structure here, there's a logic. And I think that is something that is very interesting for planning and still missing, sadly, for Canada. Yeah.
Maybe I insert myself here because I have a very related question. Oh, sorry, I didn't. Go ahead.
Linda Peake. Rob, I wonder if you could say a little bit more about the general context of planning and Indigenous peoples in Edmonton. You mentioned about the Truth and Reconciliation Commission, and I'm wondering to what extent are planners in Edmonton really willing to take on the cultural mind shift that would involve? Or do you think that, for example, that questions around Indigenous lands and claims to land are going to be seen like in heritage, as having a place in relation to heritage planning, as opposed to rethinking the way in which land use planning takes place in Canadian cities? And could you say a little bit more as well about, are there other Indigenous groups and other areas in Edmonton that might be being contested at this point in time?
So the Papaschase Reserve is a case which never goes away. It always is reintroduced, and I think we're seeing a kind of slow movement at the federal level away from the Aboriginal versus Indigenous kind of classification system, which is very much like the South African kind of racial classification system, which will, I mean, if that continues, would return a kind of right of claim to the descendants of the Papaschase tribe, and especially given the argument that they took script because they were starving, and that was a deliberate policy at the time. So Indigenous people right now are being incorporated, I think, more in the process. I don't see, I see the River Valley as really the kind of key point of intersection of interests. There is a traditional burial ground. There was an attempt to put gravestones on it and a monument and to make it a sort of site. And it really fails architecturally. It was done by quite good architects locally, Manask Isaac, and it just doesn't work. It's this kind of insignificant and odd-looking patch of land next to a brand new bridge which has been constructed, which is a kind of one of these Calatrava arches. So there is so we're right in the middle of a River Valley strategy, and central to that is the Indigenous kind of voice. And I think it's through the parklands that we're seeing more of an Indigenous input and politics. The first meeting they came and then they walked out, and that was kind of the end of the policy. It went back, and they went back to the drawing boards for 2 years. So I think there's an embrace. So what the city has done is embraced participatory planning and engagement and so on, and made it part of every step of municipal processes. So it's a very radical change, and they've completely restructured the bureaucracy around this idea of engagement and citizen participation. So it's a shock coming back to Ontario after that, just in terms of that accessibility. But how much, what training and equipment do planners have to deliver that? At the level of provincial planning associations and professional bodies, there's no training you can take. You have to do quite a bit of research in Canada to find the Australian literature on settler-colonial societies, which then sort of puts the Canadian situation in perspective. So the River Valley is the current sort of thing, and I think it's more in the process of that. And then, of course, this huge Indigenous population, which the economy has been very robust, which has meant employment for everyone. But as that declines, we see more and more, the most vulnerable are on the street first. There has been some really fantastic social housing work done by Indigenous housing societies, so Housing First initiatives, specifically taking up Indigenous cultural issues that underlie kind of, the trauma of people's own experience of not only the residential schools, but essentially being racially profiled their entire lives. So Housing First means you have a accommodation where people are allowed to drink. In fact, they're given alcohol on a schedule, rather than the traditional approach, which has been you must be dry and free of addictions before you can receive any assistance of any kind, which doesn't work for many people. Yeah. I think the other challenge, as we go forward, that on the horizon for Canada, is what I would call the other victims. And those are the people who grew up in cities, maybe took public transit, and were assaulted or were witnesses to knife fights, etc., public drunkenness, and have that, a deeply ingrained fear of Indigenous people, essentially. And that's a kind of victim position. I think it's heavily gendered. And so if you're a young woman who grew up in Winnipeg in the 60s and 70s, there's no way you want to go to a meeting with, I'm stereotyping them as well now, but there's a real fear of, have the Indians who were always fighting, down my block are going to be at this meeting. So I think that's another group there that somehow or other needs to make its peace for the system, for the situation to change. And I don't know if that takes a generation to accomplish. And how do you do that?
Well, and I have a question which is very much about that. It's an impression that I had, but it's maybe a Toronto impression and maybe different in Saskatoon and Edmonton and Winnipeg, where there is a more tangible Indigenous presence in the city, that here we have a vigorous urbanist debate. Vancouver, Toronto, Montreal, it's all about density and creating more urbanity and all that. And it seems to me in cities that have 16 or 25%, like I think downtown Saskatoon now is 25, 30% Indigenous population, young, thriving to a large degree. It seems to me from a Toronto point of view that those populations and their concerns are largely absent from the urbanist debates and also suburbanist debates in Canada. Is that impression correct?
The young Indigenous professionals in city centers, it's too cynical, but so we have infill. It's been quite a debate. Hey, Toronto just got urban agriculture. You just got chickens. Yes, we got chickens and pigs, and so it's interesting.
More settler-colonialism, though.
Sorry?
Chickens and pigs is more settler-colonialism.
Yes. It's interesting in a city center where you would have expected it on the outskirts. The cynical question in my mind is to what extent infill is used to displace and to essentially start a kind of ethnic cleansing in the city center. Also, cities are businesses. They want to increase the taxes that are paid. And so if you can get people who are going to live in more expensive houses or perhaps expand their houses, if you can get them to buy the properties, your budget can increase. Always in tension in many Canadian cities with the suburbs, or you don't want white flight to the suburbs. You don't want your professional class moving out because then you lose their taxes to satellite towns and cities. So there's a cynical side to this, which makes me wonder about that. And similarly, stadia and major public infrastructure projects are great ways to 1 or 2 square city blocks at a time displace populations that are destitute in the city center, or are kind of visual, not appealing. So that's gone on in Edmonton, and one wonders about this sort of homesteading of the city center. There's a new, fantastically successful young Indigenous professional class that is perhaps less politicized than the previous generation, but more widely kind of distributed and involved in a wider range of institutions. So I think that they are kind of carrying the roots of change to those institutions. Yeah.
Thank you, Rob. Any more comments or questions? If that is not the case, please join me in thanking Rob again for a fantastic talk and great answers to your questions. Thank you.
Thank you.